Hey you guys, and welcome back to the Beginner's Garden. I'm in my greenhouse where my tomatoes and my peppers are living until I can plant them outside. I have grown tomatoes and peppers from seed indoors for my entire garden journey for 10 years. And over the years, I've used lots of different methods of indoor seed starting. I think it's fun as gardeners to be able to test different methods of doing things. And this is the second year that I've used a unique method of starting tomatoes from seed. And I say unique because it's different for me. A lot of people do it, but it was new to me last year and I liked it so much I wanted to do it again this year. It does take a few extra steps, but I'm really enjoying this method and I think that it's making overall very healthy tomato and pepper seedlings. So I wanted to share with you from start to where we are today, what I've done to grow all of these tomatoes and using the same method with peppers that you see here. Since I grow several dozen tomato plants each year, I definitely have to get organized. So the first thing that I do is I list out all the varieties that I'm going to grow along with the quantities that I will need for my garden. And before I plant one seed, I want to make sure and create all of my labels so I can keep all of the seeds organized. While I will be putting these seedlings under grow lights indoors, I like to do the whole process in my greenhouse just because it makes it more tidy. So that's why you see all of these things being done in the greenhouse. After I listed out all of the quantities and made labels for all the tomatoes I wanted to grow, I filled up my Epic 4-cell trays with sifted potting mix. You can use seed starting mix for this as well, but I start so many seeds indoors. Buying those packets of seed starting mix has proved to be a little bit too expensive. And so I use Pro Mix and I use a sifter. This is the one that I use. You can find it on my Amazon favorites. It makes it so easy to be able to put the potting mix through this and you get a very fine potting seed starting mix to go with it. So I sift out regular potting soil and that makes a seed starting mix. But I don't just put the sifted potting mix directly in the cell tray. I like to moisten it first. And for me, I prefer to mix up a dilution of organic Rev. So I moisten the seed starting mix with a little bit of organic Rev. I don't really measure it. You can do an ounce to a gallon. I usually just fill my jug up with water and put a little bit of it in there. And what the organic Rev is it's a growth stimulant, and I use this in every phase of my seed starting process and have noticed a big difference once I started using it. So I wanted to share with you a little bit how I use this. And when I moisten the seed starting mix, I don't get it too wet. I just want it to be able to absorb some water. And then I put it in these cell trays, get them ready to go. After I label each individual cell, I'm going to start sowing the seeds. Now this is what makes this method different. And you may have heard it called a dense sowing method because I'm planting lots of seeds in one cell. The purpose is not for them all to continue growing out in that one cell, but to be able to have them all sprout, and then I'll separate them later. Like I said, it's called the dense sowing method, and I have to be honest, I was kind of skeptical about it, and I was nervous about my ability to be able to separate all the seedlings to make it where they wouldn't die, but I found that tomatoes in particular are very forgiving, and this works actually really well. Another benefit to putting all of the seeds in one cell of one variety is that this makes the seed starting process, especially for as many tomatoes and peppers that I'm growing, to go really fast. And I can also only have to worry about transplanting the ones that sprout. So I don't have spotty germination or cells or soil blocks that nothing sprouted in. This way I can really focus on the seeds that actually do sprout and grow. How many seeds I actually put in the cell depends on how many of those plants I need. For example, with San Marzano, I'm putting a lot of seeds in those cells because I'm growing a lot of San Marzano. But with some of my slicing tomatoes like pineapple or Cherokee Purple, where I'm only doing a couple, I didn't sow that many per block. After I sprinkled them on top of the soil, then I used a dibber or also a dibbler that my husband made me using a 3D printer. You can see it right here. I like it because it has the seed depth on here, but I don't really use that for that purpose in this way. I usually want the tomato seeds to only be as deep as twice the circumference or the diameter of the seed itself, and this just makes it an easier process. After I get the seeds buried, then I like to sprinkle with vermiculite. This is optional. One thing I've noticed has been a problem with indoor seed starting is making sure the water is regulated. And if you get too much water, a lot of times you have mold form on the top, and that can inhibit seed germination. It helps to absorb the water, and I haven't had any issues with mold when I use the vermiculite on top. It also makes the environment more inhospitable for fungus gnats. Even though I didn't deal with those this year, I have in the years past. And so I started sprinkling with vermiculite, and so far I haven't had a problem. From here, after I get all of the seeds sown, I'm actually taking them back into my grow room. I like to cover with some kind of a humidity dome. Usually that ends up being plastic wrap. And then I'm watching to see how long it takes for those seeds to sprout. Once the seeds start to sprout, then I take the humidity dome off or the plastic wrap off, but they're still underneath grow lights for a little while. And that brings us to stage 2. Stage 2 is when I separate the sprouted seedlings from one another and put them in individual cells. And for this, I use the Epic 6-cell tray. I found it to be really helpful to be able to get those small seedlings in just enough soil. As you may have seen in my celery sowing video, the problem with putting seedlings in cells that are too big is that it's really hard to maintain moisture. And that's why I found this to work really well, putting those little tiny seedlings in this 6-cell tray. I know different gardeners do this at different stages. Some like to wait until the first true leaves form, and I did that for a lot of these because I was actually waiting for most of them to sprout, and so some did have some true leaves. What I've noticed with the true leaves appearing though is that the bigger the seedling gets, the more roots are going to be involved that you have to separate. And so I kind of like to separate them a little sooner than when their true leaves get to be too big. But again, tomatoes are actually pretty forgiving, and it works even if you wait a little bit longer or if you do it sooner. This year, I ended up separating these seedlings about 11 days after the initial sowing. When it came to actually separating the seedlings and putting them in the Epic 6-cell tray, I didn't want to just use sifted potting mix that had no other nutrients. In this case, I'm going to bump up the nutrient level in the potting mix. That way, when the seedlings do start getting their true leaves, they have a ready source of nutrients available. So for this, I add potting soil, which I don't think that I've sifted. If there are any big pieces that wouldn't fit in this tray, then I would sift it out. But for the most part, I just use straight potting soil, worm castings, and then again, I water with a diluted mixture of organic Rev. On top of that, I also like to add either garden tone or plant tone to put a little bit of extra fertilizer in the potting soil at a pretty small rate. But again, all of this is so when the true leaves start forming and the plants start growing, they have nutrients ready to go at this stage. The actual separating part was the part that I was so nervous about because I thought I would kill my seedlings. But the process was actually pretty easy. Growing these seedlings in the 4-cell tray made it really easy to be able to pop out that block of soil with all the seedlings and then separate them by hand one by one. From there, I had a mixture of half organic Rev, half water. Again, I eyeballed it, and I dipped the roots in that mixture. You can see I just kind of let them hang out there in the mixture as I went and planted them each in the Epic cell trays. What it does is it coats the roots in this natural carbon source, and that helps to stimulate root growth. I've actually done side-by-side tests on using Rev and not using Rev, and the root growth when I use Rev is significantly more. That's why anytime I'm dealing with plants, whether I'm separating seedlings here or potting up, I'm always adding Rev because I want to get those roots going as fast as possible. From there, it's just a matter of punching a hole in the potting mix, putting the seedling in the potting mix, covering it back up, and then I usually water with either plain water or a diluted Rev mixture. Again, like an ounce to a gallon, definitely not the concentration that I dip it in. Not that you couldn't do that, it's just, it's not necessary. That's the great thing about Rev is that it's not a fertilizer, so you can't overdo it. I just prefer to make my Rev go a little bit further and do the 50-50 mixture when I'm dipping it, And then when I'm watering it, I'll do it in a much more diluted mixture. After I separate all of these seedlings and label them, of course, I put them back inside under grow lights for them to continue growing. And on nice days in the greenhouse, I will gradually start bringing them out to the greenhouse. What I found is that as soon as the true leaves start to form, I like to give them access to the sunlight. It makes it easier for them to acclimate to the sunlight itself. I find that I really don't even have to harden them off when they go out into the garden because they're so used to being in the greenhouse in the sunlight. But I do take them in for cold nights. As young plants, they really are sensitive to cold. So for me, I don't like them to get below 60 or even in the 50s, especially at this young stage. So I take them inside at night and then bring them out in the sunny days. From here, I let them grow for a week or two. I think this time it was about 13 days, although I could have done this sooner before I do my final potting up. Stage 3 is when I pot up. The small seedlings are not going to last very long in these small epic cell trays. They're perfect to get them started, but they need to be bumped up pretty quickly. The method for potting up is very similar to the method of separating the seedlings. I'm essentially using the same potting mix, the potting soil with worm castings, with organic rev, with a little bit of plant tone or garden tone. I think for this one I did plant tone because plant tone is a little bit higher in nitrogen, and at this point in a tomato or pepper's growth, nitrogen is most important. When they start fruiting, they definitely don't need as much nitrogen, but for this time I used the plant tone. And next came selecting the pot size. This is where it was a little bit of a decision for me to try to decide which plant size to select. And for the larger tomatoes, I ended up going with a larger pot. For the larger ones, I ended up choosing a larger pot. This is a 4.5 or 4.25 inch pot. And I like to do the deeper pots with tomatoes because I like to be able to plant them deeper. For a smaller tomato plant, I would do a smaller pot. This one is a 3.25 or 3.5 inch pot. So you can see the difference between these two pots. I bought both of them from Greenhouse Megastore, but depending on how big the tomato is depended on what size pot I chose. The key is, again, I want the pot to be big enough for the roots to expand, but not too big where moisture control is going to be a challenge. But honestly, for all of these plants, I probably could have gone either way. For the ones that I chose, the smaller pots, I may have to end up potting them up a second time before they go out into the garden. It just depends on our weather. But for the ones in the larger pots, these will definitely stay in these pots until we need to put them outside. Again, same process here. I created a 50-50 organic rev to water mixture to dip the root ball in before I transplanted them into a bigger pot. I mixed up the same combination of potting soil as I mentioned before, and then before I actually put it into the pot, I'm going to put that potting soil at the bottom and try to adjust the depth where the tomato plant itself is going to be planted pretty deep. The reason I want to plant it deep is that tomatoes are unique in that their stems will actually send out roots. So not only will that help more roots to be able to grow, but it will also make for a sturdier plant if we can get it deep and then they start growing stronger in the pot. As you can see, when I took out the plants from these epic cell trays, it was very easy to pop the root ball out with my finger. And as you can see, the roots were really ready to expand into a new pot, but they didn't circle. By looking at the roots, I probably, again, should have done this a couple of days before, but one reason I love the epic cell trays is because they have a lot of the benefits of soil blocks in that they don't circle the roots and they kind of stop at the edge. And that way, when I transfer them into a new pot, those roots are ready to go and they establish very quickly. That's why I think a perfect blend of using the epic cell trays and the organic rev helps these tomatoes be able to grow and establish really fast. Not to mention the sun from the greenhouse, that definitely plays a role as well. Once I get all of these tomatoes potted up, now they just need to sit and grow a little bit longer before the garden is ready for them. At this point, I try to bring them out into the greenhouse pretty much every day. I want them to get as much sunlight as possible. But again, if the nights are going to be where even in the greenhouse it's going to be below 50 or so, I am bringing them inside. Again, tomatoes will do fine in a greenhouse in the 40s or even the 30s, and mature tomatoes I would be able to keep out here in those temperatures. But the ones that are just potted up, I really want to handle them with care, and I don't want them exposed to those lower temperatures. In the past, I've accidentally left them out here and maybe they didn't freeze, but the next morning you could tell that they were definitely affected by the cold. So until they get established, I definitely don't want to expose them to too much cold. At this point, I think most of our freezes are over, and I do have a heater. So as long as the temperature outside is going to be in the 30s or above, I will crank up the heater so that the greenhouse can stay a little bit warm at night, and that way they can stay in here full time. This helps them completely to acclimate to the sunlight outside. I will open the windows to get them used to the breeze. And then when it comes to actually planting them into the garden, I will start taking them out of the greenhouse because the greenhouse does filter the light some, and I do want them to get exposed to full sun and the full effects of the wind. But that process maybe takes a couple of days, as opposed to going straight from a grow light outside could take a week or two. As far as when I'm gonna plant these out in my garden, of course I want to wait until after my last frost has passed. But sometimes it's hard to know when is that last frost going to be. We can look at our average last frost dates to get an idea of when, but when it comes to be about that time, I like to keep an eye on my 10-day forecast. And if any of the nights are going to be in the 40s, I will tend to wait. Not only will nights in the 40s possibly mean down the line that they could drop and drop and drop and you could get into freezing, but the tomatoes themselves are not going to grow when nights are in the 40s. They're just going to sit there and sulk. They really don't do well until nights are reliably in the 50s. So if I see a 10-day forecast where the nights are all in the 50s, even the lower 50s, then I will start transplanting out my tomatoes. The goal for that is twofold. Number one, hopefully all the frost has passed. Number two, the nighttime is warm enough for the tomatoes to actually grow. But not only that, if we do get a late freeze, which we have gotten the last couple of years, the tomatoes will have had about a week or so to establish in the garden. So covering them is something that can be done if there is a late freeze, and they're going to be more able to survive that compared to a plant that's been planted and it gets to be really cold in the next couple of days before it's had a chance to establish. So we definitely want to think about the health of the plant and getting it established in the garden. That way it can withstand anything that comes along afterwards. Thank you so much for joining me in my greenhouse. It's always fun to try different methods, and I recommend you try some new ones yourself. If you've tried this, let me know in the comments what your experience has been. I would love to hear from you, and hopefully if this is something you want to do in the future, it'll give you a roadmap on how to do it. If you like this video, make sure and like and subscribe, and check out my podcast, The Beginner's Garden Podcast, and I will chat with you again next week.